Before we get into this continuation, I highly recommend you watch my island video beforehand, which will be linked in the description, and I'll also go over the island special in order to justify how the next season starts. After the party and donating some of the funds to animal charities, Caleb would give up the 100K for a shot at the million, prompting everyone else to follow suit. Now, because Courtney isn't here to hijack the air balloon, causing the chain of events that lead to the selected lot of people being dragged into the water, causing a tie which becomes the cast for the next season, I decided to just use the random number generator again, opting for the same number of people as in the original. The only person I gave an automatic spot to was Caleb, since it wouldn't really make any sense for the previous winner not to play, since he's the one whose decision to go for the million is what caused the season to happen in the first place. I think Team E-Scope would still happen, just with Owen replacing Noah, and those three would have the suitcase, but Owen would need to go to the bathroom like in the original, allowing Fiore to sneak by and steal it, but she would fall into a trap Izzy purposefully set up in case someone tried to pull something like that, which would then prompt Izzy to swing from a vine and yoink the briefcase back, but accidentally drop it in the river again, and once Fiore breaks free from the trap, it would snap a bunch of branches, causing a domino effect, pushing everyone you see here into the water at the same time. As for everyone else who didn't make it, I'll explain their roles once we get into the aftermath. And with that, let's dive into it. The first episode is mostly filler. It's the one where Chef controls the giant monster thing and puts all the contestants in a bouncy house until Owen breaks the machine due to his weight, and he wins like a fake meal or something. Anyway, since Owen is still here, that would still happen, and I don't think anyone else would find a way to stop or escape this thing, since that's pretty much impossible. It's basically this universe's version of Mechagodzilla, so yeah, I think this episode is largely the same as canon. Owen and Izzy would now start getting along with each other after Izzy's impressed with how Owen took down the monster, and after they worked together in the island special, and so Owen would start to develop feelings for her. Beyond that, Beth, Lindsay, and Rosa Maria are all still in an alliance and promise to stick together no matter what this time. Rosa Maria has a confessional saying this time she'll make sure no one else drives them apart. Bowie and James also have a joint confessional where they say playing dirty got them far last season, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and they both fist bump. Now, during this episode, the official teams aren't actually made yet. People in this challenge just kind of pick their own groups by preference, and so based off of that, this is what I think the groups would be. Cody and Sierra, Rosa Maria, Beth and Lindsay, Bowie and James, Caleb, Alejandro, Owen, Izzy, and Z, and finally Ellie and Fiore, where really Fiore would just go alone, but she and Ellie would run into each other, and they would figure that they may as well join each other even though they don't like each other, making 5 total groups. Because Duncan and Gwen both aren't here, no one would have knowledge on horror movies to help them out, so I just used the random number generator again to determine which team would find the eggs first, and it ended up being Beth, Lindsay, and Rosa Maria. However, with Chef hunting them down, I don't think they'd be able to escape him. And Beth wouldn't really want to try standing up to him again since it didn't really work out so well for her last season. So now, Lindsay would do it instead, and it'd actually work, as she kicks Chef in the shin, which holds him off just long enough for Beth to grab one of the eggs and get to the finish line. Beth celebrates but apologizes to the others for not getting them the win too, but Lindsay notices an extra egg in the corner and becomes the other winner by bringing that one to the finish. Rosa Maria congratulates the two of them as they both celebrate their accomplishment. The big group would come by next, and when Lindsay and Beth both rub it in, Alejandro congratulates them in gentlemanlike fashion, but Beth tells him off and says she doesn't need his approval. Alejandro says in confessional that rebuilding his image after what he did in season 1 is gonna be tough, even though what he's really out for, beyond even winning, is revenge. Now onto the vote, which is a double elimination. Since Owen and Izzy were in a large group, they wouldn't be making out all the time, though I can't really say the same for Sierra and Cody. Because they were eliminated back-to-back last season, they would have spent a lot of time together at Playa de Losers, which would give them ample time to become more intimate as a couple, as they would essentially be in paradise for a long while. Plus, I think Cody wouldn't really want to strategize anymore since it made him feel dirty last season, so he'd just enjoy being with Sierra, only this time it'd actually be healthy and mutual, albeit somewhat breaching TMI territory, kinda like Bridget and Jeff in this episode originally. Speaking of Bridget and Jeff, they're taking their place here. The votes would definitely be spread all over the place. Some people would vote for Beth, some people would vote for Alejandro, some for Fiore, but I think most people would just be too annoyed with Cody and Sierra, not wanting them in the game or potentially on their team, so they get voted out for the same reasons Bridget and Jeff did. Because Beth and Lindsay were the winners of the last challenge, they get to be team captains. Disappointed they're on separate teams, but have faith in each other nonetheless. Beth also chooses first since she won first. Beth chooses Rosa Maria as a friendship pick. Lindsay would choose Caleb since he's a good pick and he's a hot guy. Beth would then choose Bowie since he's a good player and she doesn't have beef with him. Lindsay would then choose Owen because she just thinks he's cool. Beth would then choose James since Bowie would want her to do so and she has no reason not to oblige. And Lindsay would pick Izzy since Owen would want her to do so and she has no reason not to oblige. Beth then picks Alejandro because Rosa Maria would hate to say it, but she would want to keep Al at arm's length and would call him a snake when they pick him. Al would just compliment them back. Lindsay would pick Ellie because she's the best option by default. And finally, Beth would pick Fiore, since Rosa Maria doesn't want to pick Z because he's stupid and also because of what he did in Season 1, which hurt even if it was Al's idea. So he goes to the grips. Now the first part of the challenge is to get the equipment up the hill, in which Hungry Owen and Caleb get the equipment up the hill first, so they have the advantage in the acting part. Grips choose Caleb to act this time since, even though Izzy goes originally, Caleb is basically a model, so obviously they pick him. As for the gaffers, Alejandro would go to prove his worth to his team. Caleb wouldn't be emotive enough as an actor, while Alejandro can easily do the gangster routine and make Chef cry since Jeff is the one judging. Even if he can't, Chef would do so willingly because he would want to form a secret alliance with him. This is the episode where Chef makes an illegal alliance with someone, and I think he'd view Alejandro's charm as reminiscent of his younger self, and as an added bonus, he's already willing to play dirty. But Chef would tell Alejandro practically begging for scraps is pathetic and that he needs to step up his game. Alejandro would fully agree and they would shake on it. Alejandro would have a confessional saying this is a welcome surprise. So, because the gaffers won, the grips go to elimination. And I think it's pretty obvious Caleb loses 2-4. Everyone except he and Lindsay vote for him, since he's the one that ultimately lost them the challenge, so there's no one else to target. Plus, he won the last season, so there's even more reason to vote him off. Lindsay would be sad, but Caleb just gives her a kiss goodbye and tells her he was in over his head anyway, and that she deserves to win way more than he does, as Lindsay would smile and blush as he gets in the limousine, and they would officially start dating. Bear in mind, this couple wouldn't just happen out of the blue, since they already had a connection in Season 1 before this too. Chef and Alejandro would begin to strategize, since Alejandro was cunning and smart like that. He and Chef would be carefully choosing when and when not to intervene with the challenge to maximize gain but minimize suspicion. Because Chef would tell him this is a reward challenge, Alejandro wouldn't want Chef to rig it for him. Everyone would try and fail the surfboard challenge, Bowie would do well until the seagulls, but Z would ultimately win by doing absolutely nothing besides getting lucky. Everyone on his team looks at him in shock and asks how he did that, and Z just responds, "You gotta ride the waves, dude," before drinking his soda. So they get a 30-second head start in the sandcastle building contest, but the team with the head start's castle got ruined by seagulls, and since Beth is on the other team, she would still come up with the idea to use the friendship bracelets to rebuild their castle, meaning the dance-off tiebreaker still happens. I'm gonna say it's between Bowie and Z would win once again by doing nothing. So the groups get the party and chant Z's name, while on the losing team, Alejandro decides to openly taunt James and point to Bowie, telling him to watch out for James stabbing him in the back, since that's what he did to him last season. Bowie just says, "Thanks, but I already know what I'm getting into," and then tells Al that he made the final 3 last season, while Al didn't because of a skill issue. This makes Alejandro curse in confessional in a fit of rage. This one is an elimination episode, so Chef would plan on rigging this one. For the donkey saddling, Owen still chases the donkey and wins, and even though Beth and Lindsay originally make it, now that they're on separate teams, I don't think either of them would make it, since they'd be more nervous and not be holding each other's hands to keep them placed properly. I think everyone else should make it fine. And in order to even up the people, Fiore would not want to go and says it's scary. Beth wouldn't buy her nice girl charade and tells her to go anyway, but Alejandro intervenes and says Beth is being cruel because Fiore is just a child. When Beth continues telling both of them off, Rosa Maria stops her, noting how it's a really bad look for her going off like this in front of everyone, with everyone looking awkwardly at Beth the whole time. So she nervously smiles and waves, and then coughs and says it's fine if Fiore doesn't want to go. So with it being these 4 to these 4 landing on the donkey, tiebreaker still happens, and Owen would still drink all the water beforehand, which somehow has Chris give his team the lassos instead of the others. So that would still happen. Chef would pull Alejandro aside and ask if he's ready for him to cheat. Alejandro decides to tell Chef to hold off this time because he's got a plan. Alejandro then asks Fiore if she's okay, and she tells him she's fine and to go away. But Alejandro tells Fiore that they have a common enemy, Beth, and they should work together to get rid of her. Fiore says, "I'm listening," and Alejandro whispers the plan in her ear, making her grin. Now, because the gaffers are the ones being chased, they would be running to the other side of the runway where the other ropes are. I think Izzy and Ellie could probably get Bowie, James, and Rosa Maria before they get to the end, but Beth's tenacity and Alejandro's skill as he's also carrying Fiore would allow the three of them to get to the other ropes. So Alejandro would tell Beth to catch as he passes her a rope, but secretly untangles it before doing so that when Beth catches it, she already gets tied up before she can make use of that rope. And then Alejandro and Fiore would fake trip while running, but it would actually be convincing because they'd both run away for a bit first, meaning that the Grips win. And they celebrate as Z drinks from his soda. Beth would accuse Alejandro of sabotaging her on purpose, and both Al and Fiore just gaslight her and just walk away, calling it a sad attempt to cover up her own mistakes. And Rosa Maria would tell her it's not worth it. As for the vote, Beth and Rosa Maria vote for Alejandro, and everyone else votes for Beth, meaning Beth is eliminated in a 4-2 vote. Beth asks Bowie and James why they voted for her, after all she did for them as team leader and that Al's a snake, and they'd both just respond by saying, "Yeah, but he's a useful snake, plus what you did to Fiore was just plain hard to watch." Beth would hug Rosa Maria goodbye and tell her she believes she can win this before getting into the limousine. Alejandro says in confessional the plot went great and he wants to go to the end with Fiore, since she's a little girl so she would be really easy to beat in the final challenge, yet is also cunning enough to be a really good ally in getting rid of everyone else. So a pretty sweet deal overall. So, for most of the aftermaths, I'm not going to go too deep into them since they usually don't have much to do with the main story, so I'll just kind of give a brief summary of what happens in each of them in this timeline. Even though Sierra and Cody are both eliminated now, I still think Jeff and Bridget would still be the hosts, since they seem to be the best fit for a hosting team out of all the contestants, and even though Bridget's not a part of this cast in this timeline, Jeff still could have met her between seasons, and they'd become a couple naturally and get this gig, as non-contestants like Josh and Blanley have been recruited to host Aftermath stuff before, so I see no reason why the same can't be true for Bridget here. Sierra and Cody would realize they both got booted early both seasons, and Cody would start to want some space upon this realization. Caleb would talk about how being last season's winner kinda screwed him over, but it's cool that he and Lindsay are dating now. And Beth would admit she was too mean this season, and that she was only trying to make up for how gullible she was in season 1, but that she'll actually be a good person from now on, and that's about it. This challenge starts with choosing someone from the opposing team to be in a prison cell, not knowing what they'll actually have to do. Even though Lindsay was chosen originally, because she has a bigger leadership role now, they would just pick Owen instead since he was also picked in the original, and on the other team I think they would just pick Fiore because of the fact that she's a child. And because it's a gross eating challenge, Owen obviously wins. And with that advantage, the Grips still get the shovel for the second part of the challenge, where they have to dig underground and find the finish line above ground. Now, of course, since this is an elimination challenge and Alejandro has no reason to risk losing again this time with Beth gone, Chef would now actually cheat in the challenge for real. So he'd ensure the shovel the Grips have is a thinly veiled broken one. And he'd also tell Alejandro what general direction he has to dig in order to get to the finish line first. And no one would have any reason to be suspicious of him, so the gaffers win and everyone is none the wiser. This is also the episode where Izzy returns to the winning team, but since Izzy is still in the game this time, I had to pick one of the already previously eliminated contestants in this timeline, and the only one that makes sense would be Caleb. Since Beth, Cody, and Sierra don't really have much else to do, so I'll just say Caleb got an extra life in the game as a consolation prize for winning the first season, which is kinda dumb, but whatever. Honestly, I think the team would be happy to have an extra set of muscles, so yeah, he'd be good with the team. As for the elimination, Owen and Izzy would really want to stay in the game longer, so they'd beg Lindsay to help them vote someone else in a 3-2 vote, and in exchange they'll do anything. To signify this, Owen would grab her leg and say something like, "Please, please," with a banana split with whipped cream on top, yummy. With this opportunity presenting itself on a silver platter, this is where Lindsay would get off on the power trip a little bit, entering her Admiral Lindsay her hotness phase. And Owen and Izzy immediately grovel to her with that new title, especially since now she's already basically the team leader anyway. So, in a 3-2 vote, Ellie is eliminated. Ellie would be shocked, but everyone would just kinda say that she was a downer and shrug, saying it was nothing personal, and Ellie would be pissed that she basically got screwed unfairly in both seasons now. For the most part, this is another filler episode. Alejandro and Caleb are both naturally intelligent people, so they're the most likely to know about all the diseases and crack the code. And I also doubt either of them would want to pull the all-nighter studying just for our reward challenge anyway, so neither would get infected. So the gaffers win. Everyone on the grips was actually here originally except Z, so the only difference there is just more visual gags with Z, but that's it. Anyway, since Alejandro and Caleb cracked the case, the reward for who gets to see a loved one would just be Caleb, since Alejandro doesn't like his brother anyway and wouldn't want to risk seeing him, and he would also see this as a good way to build a bridge with Caleb by just giving him the prize. So Caleb would just go on a nice date with Lindsay now that they're dating, which no one would really have a problem with since, again, Caleb helped win the challenge, so it's not like he's a traitor or anything. This challenge is the one where they have to scare each other, and then the team with the advantage has to scare the losing team out of the room at night. Chef wouldn't even need to cheat here since the gaffers are obviously going to scare way less easily. The only person I think would be difficult to scare would be Lindsay, since now she's really taken charge even more so than in the original where she was already pretty tough to crack. But even still, all her teammates give their team the disadvantage for the first half of the challenge. And for the second half of the challenge, Chef could easily give Alejandro the idea and special effects they need to turn Fiore into a really convincing dead child's ghost or something, which I think would be enough to do Lindsay in. So once again, the gaffers win, sending the grips to elimination, and come on, Z is obviously losing here. The other three are in an alliance, so yeah, this one's a no-brainer. Alejandro and Chef would note how his team is now twice the size, and how it feels like they barely even need to try at this point, and that the game is as good as theirs. But the episode would close out with Fiore secretly hearing this conversation with a smirk on her face, not choosing to tell Alejandro about her discovery yet until the time is right, since they're still essentially allies at this point. Again, this episode is just filler, and the first half of the challenge doesn't even matter since the winners get a code combination for the underwater drain, which ends up being useless because of the flooding, and also Owen would still get the jaw injury, which makes them automatically win anyway, but none of that really matters because Harold isn't here to save them this time, so I just said Chef would be able to rescue them since he's much closer to one of the contestants this time, in a secret alliance anyway. So the challenge would basically be cancelled. But as retribution for Owen's injury, I think the team, which really just means Lindsay, gets to pick someone from the opposing team to switch to them. And Lindsay obviously picks Caleb since they are dating and he's a good player. And the whole Admiral Lindsay her hotness thing would be something Caleb is totally into because, you know, we've seen with Priya that he likes strong, determined, competitive women, so yeah. This episode is where things get a bit complicated. For the first part of the challenge for the coolest explosion, Lindsay and Izzy could combine their efforts to make a glitter bomb, and since Duncan isn't here this time to oppose her, the grips would get the advantage of defending the chest instead of attacking it. Now this is where I think the whole team starts to get a bit suspicious of how well Alejandro is doing in challenges, given that the last one was a bust, and besides that, they won the last three in large part due to Alejandro. And now that it's much closer to the merge, I think Rosa Maria would speak up and tell Alejandro she thinks he's hiding something in front of the team. Bowie and James would both agree with Rosa Maria in confessional, but say better she bring it up than them. Alejandro would obviously deny hiding anything, and then get more nervous about the whole thing, so he quietly goes to Chef and tells him about the whole thing, and though Chef would try to intervene by spying on the other team for info on where they're hiding their chest, he would be too busy fighting Izzy the whole time, who would be standing front guard, while Lindsay and Caleb hide behind a hidden bush near some trees with the chest. And so, without Chef being able to cheat for Alejandro, I think the grips win. Even if one of the gaffers do find Caleb and Lindsay, and that's a big if, I think Caleb can just carry Lindsay and the chest to safety considering the man literally carried almost his entire team on a log across the woods before, so this shouldn't really be an issue. With the accusation Rosa Maria made and the challenge loss, Alejandro would start to become noticeably nervous, something Fiore catches on to. And this is where Fiore admits to Alejandro she knows about his illegal alliance with Chef. When he tries to deny it, Fiore tells him not to bother and that she won't get in the way as long as she becomes part of the deal, making it a three-way split with the prize money. And since Alejandro doesn't exactly have much of a choice, and also he'd want to go to the end with Fiore anyway, since again, small child equals easy to beat in challenge, it kinda works out. With this new arrangement, they both agree they need to get rid of Rosa Maria. So what they do is they have Fiore try to convince Rosa Maria to vote for Bowie, since he got really far last season and he is a big threat, and Fiore tells Alejandro to talk to Bowie and James, and lie to them saying that he secretly has a crush on Caleb, and hopes they won't judge him for being into someone who's already dating someone on the other team. Doing this as a fake reveal to distract from the Chef alliance. and they both seem to buy it. Alejandro in confessional says even he couldn't think of something that diabolical, and that he's genuinely impressed with Fiore for coming up with it. Bowie and James would sympathize with Alejandro since at this point they would now be dating, but would intentionally keep it secret in order to avoid putting a target on their backs, since they're both very strong players, and the prospect of them being together would likely be too intimidating to other players. I think this couple makes sense since they're both canonically gay anyway, and they're also both very strategic and devious when they want to be, so they'd both be on the same page about having a relationship on the down low. However, since Bowie and James have essentially been a unit of two throughout the season, Fiore would have figured this out by now, which he says in confessional, and also says Alejandro is the least annoying one there, and she wants him to stick around for a while. So the vote is pretty obviously Rosa Maria, since she would probably still vote Al, but Bowie and James both vote for her since they'd see her prying earlier as invasive thanks to Alejandro's fake crush, and also they'd see him as pretty pathetic even despite their sympathy, so they'd have no reason to target him as a threat. So, in a 4-1 vote, Rosa Maria is gone. So this aftermath is where Jeff turns into Mr. Douchebag for some reason, and I have no reason to believe this wouldn't happen again, so he'd basically just try to tick off the eliminated contestants. With Ellie, she would talk about how much it sucked to get shafted twice through no fault of her own, and Jeff would basically just tell her to cry about it, especially given that he got eliminated through no fault of his own too, and you don't see him crying about it. Ellie would insist that's different since she was voted out in the bullshit Playa de Losers episode, whereas Jeff still got voted out the normal way. And Bridget would then intervene since at this point this convo would get really heated and they'd move on to the next guest. This is where they get to Z, and Jeff uses the Anvil of Truth to try to get him and confess to someone or something he's angry or bitter towards, bringing up things like his teammates in action voting him off, and Alejandro and James setting him up in Season 1, but because it's Z, he wouldn't really care and not really understand half of what Jeff is even saying. So then Jeff would just give up and move on to Rosa Maria. Rosa Maria would talk about how she feels like she let Beth down by not making it further, but Beth in the peanut gallery would comfort her and say at least they still have Lindsay to root for. Then when Jeff tries to bait Rosa Maria into not accusing Alejandro earlier in the game despite her suspicions, with Jeff suggesting the reason being that Rosa Maria was secretly into him, Rosa Maria would hardline reject this notion and Beth would back her up, soon including everyone backing her up, and the episode ends the same way as canon with Bridget pulling Jeff by the ear angrily. With Fiore now in the illegal Chef alliance, Fiore would insist Chef not help them this challenge, since that would make everyone too suspicious. So Chef agrees and then smiles as he leaves the room and lets Fiore get kidnapped and put in the safe. And Owen would get put in the safe for the other team, since that's what happened in the original. So Chef wouldn't help the gaffers, but Beth is no longer here to lure Owen out with the scented perfume for the Grips either. That said, I still think the Grips would take the lead, since they now have Izzy, and she's creative enough and knows Owen well enough to find a way to get him out, and they'd reach the bank teller first. Now, since Courtney is no longer here to sue the show, and I don't think Ripper has the potential to get good enough lawyers to do what she did despite being unfairly being kicked off last season, and I really don't want to bring back another eliminated contestant back, I once again use the random number generator for people who aren't in the cast yet to add another player, and the person I ended up with is Emma. I think this actually makes a lot of sense, since in canon Emma mentions that she is a successful Charli D'Amelio type TikTok dancer influencer with millions of followers. So having the production team opt for a person who already has a reputation online would fit in pretty well with the season and the show at large, since, you know, movie theme challenges and I Want to Be Famous in the theme song, etc. And because there's no lawsuit, Chris would pick the winner of the first part of the challenge, which would be the Grips since they got there first, but he'd still make Emma second prize just to be a dick, so she goes to the gaffers. So the Grips would have the lead, but because Owen would still be in a lack of food coma, he'd still slow his team down as he'd still be very hungry, and he'd eat the wheels of the car thinking they're donuts. Meanwhile, Emma would join the gaffers and would be sociable, and Alejandro and Bowie would both suck up to her knowing she'd now be the deciding vote between the two alliances. However, Bowie would manage to win her over the most, since once Emma starts talking about her ex-boyfriend Chase, Bowie would capitalize on this and gossip girl his way into expanding his alliance from 2 to 3 people. With this new numbers disadvantage and Fiore still in the safe, Alejandro would now become desperate enough to insist Chef helps them since he knows he might be booted if they lose now. So Chef gives him the code, and the 5 of them all manage to catch up to the other team since, Owen ate all their wheels. The rest of the challenge would be pretty similar as canon, with the grips doing the same thing they did originally by carrying all the car parts and crashing right before the finish line, while the gaffer's engine would stall out near the end but still finish first, sending the grips to elimination. And without Courtney there to piss everyone off, Owen obviously gets the boot. Even if it is a 2-2 tie with these two voting for Owen and Owen and Izzy voting for one of these two, I still think Owen would lose to Lindsay or Caleb in a tiebreaker, since it would most likely be related to the challenge in some way, which he already tanked. And more likely, I think Owen would kick himself off just to give Izzy a chance, since he already had a lot of fun and knows he's being targeted anyway. This episode is just more filler. I think James would be cool with Emma joining their team of 3, since in Disventure Camp, he's shown to be a not very insecure guy unless it comes to his clout, but he would still be okay with his relationship with Bowie being a secret, and Emma joining in their alliance. At this point, Chef would start to get tired of helping 2 contestants now, and tell them he's wearing himself thin trying to help them without getting caught. Alejandro and Fiore tell him to relax and that this is a non-elimination challenge so he can take a break anyway. Lindsay and Caleb would be too distracted by each other's caveman outfits to be effective in this challenge, but I think Izzy would go sicko mode on everyone on the other team up until Emma, who would dodge and weave and let Izzy throw herself off the pillar, impressing her whole team since she has shown to be a bit of a challenge beast and could also do like TikTok dance poses or something as maneuvers. So Chef would give the gaffers the big ribs lunch, and Alejandro and Fiore would tell Chef he need not worry since they can win without his help, as they just proved today. I know this is kind of a weird thing to do, but given this challenge needs 1v1 matchups based on skill and it needs to be balanced, I just decided that Chris would switch Emma over to the grips, since he'd also begin to notice things seem a bit too skewed towards the gaffers, which wouldn't make for good ratings. This would frustrate Bowie, but James would tell him to relax and that they don't need her, and everything is under control. So based on their performances, this is what I think the matchups look like from least to most. Even though Lindsay has definitely been stepping up her game, these 3 are just naturally more gifted and better at physical challenges. Caleb has shown to be freakishly strong, much more so than Emma, but I think Izzy is just too agile and absolutely insane for anyone to beat her, so I think she takes the top spot here. As for the gaffers, Fiore is a child. Need I say more? Bowie is obviously more athletic than James by a decent margin, and between Bowie and Alejandro, I'd say it's pretty close, but I do think Alejandro would slightly edge him out here, since acrobatics is kind of one of Alejandro's, deals, so yeah. And again, Chef would not be helping Alejandro or Fiore this episode, since he's conducting the tests, and he'd also want to distance himself from the alliance in order to not get caught. With each part of the challenge featuring each person on each team based on their performances, Round 1 would start with Lindsay versus Fiore in the slow-mo boxing. Lindsay would win this. Neither of them do any real damage to the other, but Lindsay would commit to the slow-mo way more, which is what Chris was judging anyway, since Lindsay did this in canon, so she would still do it here, whereas Fiore would just think the whole thing is stupid. Round 2 would be Emma versus James in tennis. Emma would win this simply because she's more athletic. Round 3 is Caleb versus Bowie in the ball pit wrestling. Bowie wins this because he distracts Caleb by pretending Lindsay is in danger. Caleb is embarrassed that this worked on him and now really wants to get his head back in the game. And finally, there's the slam dunk contest between Izzy and Alejandro. And Alejandro would win this because he would have more poise and do the better slam dunk, whereas Izzy would probably just slam her face onto the rim. Now, there is an argument to be made that Chris would just let the grips win 3-1 since Izzy's would be funnier and he would find that funny and want to give him the point. But it's technically supposed to be the most impressive slam dunk, not the funniest / best. So I think Chris would still give the point to Alejandro, meaning that it's a tie with 2 points of the grips and 2 points of the gaffers, so the tiebreaker still happens. Now, the thing is, the grips originally win by sucking up to Chris, but I think both teams would think of that strategy now, so it really just comes down to who sucked up to Chris more, and there's no real way to tell how to determine that, so I literally just flipped a coin and the grips won. So the gaffers lose, and the vote is pretty obviously a 2-2 tie with these 2 voting for Bowie and these 2 voting for Alejandro. But the tie would be broken by whoever did worse in the initial training course, which means that Bowie gets eliminated for being ranked 1 spot below Alejandro. Or you could just say they do a tiebreaker, which Chef would obviously rig in Alejandro's favor. Either way, Bowie is eliminated. Bowie would be shocked, and Fiore would spill about how obvious it was that he and James were a couple, and that it was only a matter of time until he'd be targeted. And now we are at the merge. There's very little I can say about this episode. Once the merge starts, Lindsay would start getting even more competitive, and as a result, Caleb would begin to feel insecure and struggle to keep up with her, accidentally getting them both tagged by lasers, making Caleb feel even more guilty. Besides that, Izzy would get to the center of the room and obtain the grappling hook, and would get everyone to escape the room with the grappling hook and blow up everyone else's bombs by cutting random wires once they get to those. Now that the first elimination round during the merge has arrived, the Chef, Alejandro, and Fiore alliance would now be back into full gear. However, Chris would still give Lindsay the head start for her Wonder Woman costume. But it wouldn't matter because even though Lindsay would do better than in the original, Caleb would distract her and she'd end up falling off the wire because of it during the course part. As for everyone else, Chef would make sure they lose, and Alejandro would throw himself under the bus in order to let Fiore win the challenge and get immunity. And since Alejandro took a bowling ball to the face, which he didn't agree to but Chef did anyway, they'd be in the clear as far as suspicions go. And for the vote, Caleb would get voted out 5-2 since everyone besides he and Lindsay would want him out since he's a massive threat. He won the last season, and he is now also in a power couple with Lindsay, and everyone wants to capitalize on this moment of weakness. Caleb apologizes to Lindsay for screwing up the game and relationship and hopes she can forgive him, which she does by giving him a kiss and telling him she'll win it for them. And Caleb tells her he believes she can do it. Not really much I can say here. Jeff would just try to bait Owen and Bowie into shit-talking Izzy and James respectively in the electric chair. This would annoy everyone and make everyone push Jeff into the electric chair and shock the douche out of him like in the original, with Jeff and Bridget making up and everyone living happily ever after. When it comes to who would be chosen to be the princess in this episode, we already know that Lindsay's foot doesn't fit in the glass, and I think Emma and Izzy wouldn't really be a good fit either, so I think Chris would think it would be funny to make Fiore be the princess, since she would obviously hate it, forcing everyone else to try and rescue her. And because Fiore is an absolute menace, I don't think it really matters who that person would be. Maybe Emma? But James would go up to Lindsay and say, hey, something is going on with Alejandro and Fiore, finding it strange how they seem virtually unstoppable, but doesn't want to vote against them yet since they don't have solid enough numbers or evidence. Plus, neither of them are as big of challenge threats as Emma or Izzy, since even though Fiore has won a couple of challenges, Emma and Izzy are just both much more physically threatening to deal with in general. So I think James and Lindsay decide to keep their suspicions private, but offer to vote with Alejandro and Fiore and ask who they want out between Izzy or Emma. So this way they can give them a false sense of security and also secure safety in the next vote. Al and Fiore are filled with glee and confessional that they now have virtually everyone on their side, not knowing that James and Lindsay don't actually trust them. So since Al and Fiore basically just get to decide who leaves here, they decide to give Chef the choice as a token of appreciation for helping them get this far, strengthening their alliance even more. And between the two, Chef obviously picks Izzy since he's had a rivalry with her throughout the season, so in a 4-2 vote, with Izzy and Emma voting James and or Lindsay, I guess, Izzy is eliminated. This is the episode where we get Detective Lindsay, and we would still get that with her still winning the challenge since Fiore would now take Courtney's place by having the Cheeto prints on her hands. The difference now would be that with Lindsay now in detective mode, she would start to notice the pattern of how Alejandro very conveniently wins most of the challenges where there's an elimination. When Alejandro counter-argues about all the challenges he lost, Lindsay admits that it's a decent point, but says she's not taking her eye off him just yet. Even though she can't prove it, she and James still very much think something is up, and continue investigating with an It's Always Sunny type board. And Lindsay would still win the actual challenge as well, like in canon, so she decides to take James to see the movie so they can strategize together. James would say in confessional that even though he misses Bowie, it's nice to have another player like Lindsay to team up with. Because no one is brought back as a mole in this universe, this episode would need to be skipped, as otherwise there would be too few people left at the end, so production would just cut this episode out altogether, which is fine since it was mostly focused on Duncan and Courtney anyway, and neither of them are here now. Because James is already an influencer type person, he would plan to record any damning evidence of foul play from other contestants, and Chef would still cheat since they would think this is an elimination round even though it's not, since the last one was a non-elimination, giving James ample evidence. Since there are 5 people and no mole, James would purposefully forfeit the first challenge in order to focus on gathering evidence, meaning that the 2v2 teams would obviously be Alejandro and Fiore versus Lindsay and Emma. In order to garner evidence, James would start by getting pictures of Chef messing with Lindsay and Emma's robot. And when Alejandro and Fiore inevitably win, with Alejandro insisting Fiore get in the robot, since he's been the punching bag enough times, James would secretly follow Alejandro and Fiore during the second part of the challenge, where they have to climb up the mountain. On the mountain, Alejandro and Fiore would argue who should get to win the second part of the challenge, which gives James the chance to record Alejandro admitting to all the times he cheated, and that he's been with Chef since the beginning in order to prove a point, not knowing this is all going to be used against him. Fiore pretends to agree with Alejandro that he should be the one to win the prize here, only to sabotage him at the last second by getting the gorilla to chase him and ending with her winning the meal. And even though this is technically a non-elimination round, when James and Lindsay show Chris the evidence of Alejandro and Chef being in cahoots with each other, cheating throughout the entire season, Alejandro would be auto-eliminated, and Chef would be put in timeout with the producers. When Alejandro tries to bring Fiore down with him, she denies it and gets to stay in the game since there's no real evidence against her, unlike with Alejandro. This episode starts with Fiore saying Chef and Alejandro have both outlived their usefulness anyway, but she also knows James and Lindsay are suspicious of her cheating too, and she knows that they're both gunning for her. So with pretty much no other option, she tells Emma she wants to go to the end with her even though she can't stand her. Fiore admits that Emma is probably the stronger player left, but it's more important to secure a spot in the finale at all than to have an easier opponent. And both of them agree Lindsay and James are planning to go to the end together anyway, so they might as well join forces to have better odds. Emma would take the initiative of shutting down the alarm of the zero-gravity coaster and get to decide the order for the second part of the challenge. Fiore would tell Emma to let her go last and make herself second to last, and have Lindsay go first in hopes of learning from her mistakes. This backfires the same way it did for Courtney in canon when the vomit comet is introduced, since the later you go, the grosser the vomit comet is to ride, and the easier it is to vomit. I can see Lindsay getting to like 15 seconds and James getting like 10 after her, and Emma being third would only get like 5 to 10 seconds with how gross it is, since one of these two probably vomited at this point. Fiore, now knowing that it's up to her to win, otherwise she's a goner, would manage to get a full 20 seconds in spite of how gross the vomit comet is. And after she wins, she'd explain in confessional that even though it was gross, she has a natural advantage here, since she's used to her kindergarten classmates being super unclean and germ-infested, calling them all disgusting and unsophisticated. So since Fiore has immunity, she could easily betray Emma here, but I don't think she'd want to, considering it'd be a 2v1 if she did that. So instead, she asks Emma who she wants to go to a tiebreaker with, since obviously Lindsay and James are both going to be voting for Emma since Fiore has immunity. And between the two of them, I think Emma would pick James since she would perceive Lindsay as the stronger player. So Lindsay and James both vote Emma, and Emma and Fiore vote James, causing yet again another tie, which is revealed to be the vomit comet again, but with 3 times speed. And even if James goes first, I still think Emma wins since she has a stronger stomach and has experience with the gross food eating challenge and stuff, so James is eliminated, and tells Lindsay he enjoyed their time scheming together and hopes she wins. Lindsay notes just how many people, Beth, Rosa Maria, Caleb, and now James, want her to win, which gives her a ton of adrenaline and determination to win going forward. This is the Bring Back the Animal from Across the Forest challenge, and this episode is really weird because now there are only 3 people instead of 4. So I'm just going to say the shark is no longer an option since no one in their right mind is going to pick that. Since Fiore won the last challenge, she gets the first pick, and between the 3 animals, I think she'd go with the beaver, thinking it's the easiest choice, and Lindsay gets the chameleon, leaving Emma with the sleepy bear, since in canon it was pretty cooperative, so Emma would figure she could work with that. But obviously Emma wouldn't have the same synergy with the bear that Owen did originally, so I don't think she could really get the bear to move, meaning the winner of this challenge is going to come down to either Fiore or Lindsay. And between the two of them, I think Lindsay is ultimately going to win this challenge. The chameleon could just blend into the blue part of Lindsay's hat, and even though her sense of direction isn't the best, I think she'd learn from being stranded in the woods last season how to better navigate, whereas Fiore would behave too much like a spoiled brat for the beaver to cooperate. Since the beaver was shown to be very civilized and only cooperated with Beth in the original, once she showed her respect. So Lindsay gets her chameleon back to camp first, meaning she gets to pick who to take to the finale. And I think it's pretty obviously Emma. Even though she's the bigger challenge threat, Fiore is just a generally mean and untrustworthy person, and Lindsay wanted her out to begin with, making the final two Lindsay versus Emma, as Fiore takes her elimination extremely bitter and disappointed. I know the finale was originally 2 episodes in action, but I found it much easier to write this as just one long episode. So Lindsay and Emma would both start on the pirate ship and get in the cannons at roughly the same time, and the conflict between Chris and Chef would still happen, only now Chris would be even angrier with Chef, asking why he insisted on cheating throughout the season for so long, and if he even believed in him and the show at all. Chef responds to Chris by saying that he has been treating him like shit this season, that they weren't nearly as close as they were before, and feels like Chris doesn't respect him nearly as much as he did during season 1. And Lindsay would replace Beth as the honorary therapist, talking both Chris and Chef through their issues, before getting launched out of the canon. The dichotomy between Beth and Duncan, where Beth fumbles the physical challenges but is really good at the social ones, and Duncan doing the opposite, would still apply here, only now with Lindsay and Emma instead. Since Emma would be better at the physical challenges, however, Lindsay is also very friendly and well-liked by everyone, and would know niche facts about just about everyone in the cast, especially among her friends like Beth, Rosa Maria, James, and Caleb. And we've seen that Emma is horrible at attempting to be a people person in episode 4 of the 2nd season of the reboot, so with each of them excelling and fumbling the social and physical challenges in opposite to each other, this would balance out, with Lindsay only having a slight advantage that would completely balance out once Chris and Chef start firing at her once they get to the reused slanted platform for the disaster challenge. So Lindsay and Emma would both be struggling as they dodge and weave all the flying objects until Emma gets trapped by the giant safe. Chris and Chef launching this giant safe would resolve their conflict same as the original, with Chef apologizing for cheating and Chris apologizing for underappreciating him, and telling him that he'll even give him a big raise on top of treating him with more consideration and respect in the future. Similar to the original, Emma would tell Lindsay to go on without her, but with all the development and support Lindsay has gotten up to this point, she wouldn't want to win that way, and would embrace her Admiral Lindsay her hotness persona, saying, "Never leave a soldier behind," and Lindsay would help her up, and they would both run towards the Aftermath studio where the rest of the cast is sitting. And they come in at the exact same time, causing it to be a tie. Now, the original winner of action is determined by a vote, but I don't think this can happen in this universe, since Lindsay is practically guaranteed to win that vote. Emma may not be super unlikable, but she's still kind of vain and not nearly as well liked or well established as Lindsay. The only 3 people I can see voting for Emma are Alejandro, Fiore, and Ellie, all out of spite, but everyone else votes Lindsay pretty handedly. So instead of a vote, Jeff and Bridget would let the peanut gallery determine the challenges, since these people would probably come up with better ideas, and it's also just easier and less messy to do this than what originally happened with the season's cast coming up with mid-ideas. Plus, this is a good way to encompass everyone in this universe's Gen 1 cast. Tess and Trent both sit this one out, being too infatuated with each other, meaning that it would come down to these 5 on the right here. So, Sugars would be a talent show, Lindsay would win. Ripper would just be whoever could flatter him the most, take him out on a date, soothe his ego. Lindsay would win that one. Joe's would be weightlifting, Emma would win that one. And Eva would be to fight over a shark-infested pool, which Emma also wins. This makes Harold's challenge the final one, which determines the winner of the season. And this challenge would be the same as the original, the treadmill wall challenge thing that he built at Steve's camp or whatever. Emma and Lindsay would pose and dodge for a while, before this goes on for too long, so Jeff and Bridget decide to just put both of them on the treadmill at the same time, and both of them look in shock as the next wall doesn't have a body-shaped hole in it, and they ultimately realize the expectation is that they jump over it. The alternate endings are determined by the next scene, which has the camera facing the other side of the wall, where one of the 2 contestants successfully gets over it, while the other slams directly into the wall. Lindsay would obviously have the canon ending since, let's be real, she's pretty much the main character of this season and deserves it more. And Emma and the rest of the cast would congratulate her and celebrate her victory. Emma's ending would be a bit more awkward since most people would be rooting for Lindsay, but Lindsay would congratulate Emma all the same on her big victory, and everyone else would too since nobody really hates her, they just don't love her, but probably still admit she was a really strong player who deserved to win. And that's going to be it for this video. Next is going to be World Tour, which may take a bit to set up with the aftermath leading up to it and the additional new cast members, but yeah, see you then.